Civil rights and voting rights groups are planning to send up to 10,000 volunteers out on Election Day to monitor the polls and help ensure that every vote gets counted. But is that enough? Many people are taking things into their own hands, initiating voting drives in their own communities and educating themselves on their rights at the polls. Today, we're going to take a closer look at what you can do to make sure your vote gets counted on November 4th. And we'll also examine some of the structural changes some people say we need to make to our whole voting system, that obscure but decisive entity known as the Electoral College, for example. How will reform of that and other changes in the process of voting in the USA get us closer to a real democracy? We'll also check back in with folks in Columbus, where early voting has started. They've been on the streets getting people to the polls. We'll hear all about it. Joining us in studio is Stephen Carbo, Senior Program Director of the Democracy Program at Demos. Thanks for coming in, Stephen. Also with us, Steve Rosenfeld, Senior Fellow at alternate.org, an old colleague of mine, not so old, author of Count My Vote, A Citizen's Guide to Voting. Thanks for coming in, Steve.
Great to be here.
Sam Husseini, another not so old colleague of mine. He's the founder of voterpact.org. And joining us a little later from Columbus, we have Tate Hausman from Vote Today Ohio. Let me start with the very big picture here, people. And I think I'm going to start with my first question to you, Stephen. Do we have a democracy in this country? All week we've talked about the challenges to voting. At what point is this something else?
Well, I think we have a democracy if everyone is able to participate. Everyone has an equal opportunity to participate. And I think democracy has been an ideal that we've been shooting for hundreds of years. We're not there totally. We've got large gaps in the electorate based on class, based on race. Poor people are registered and voting at much lower rates. African Americans, Latinos are participating at lower rates. There's more that the government can and should do to make sure that everyone who wants to participate can. What do you say, Sam? Do you think we have a democracy?
I think as the franchise of voting has expanded to include more and more people, there have been a series of mechanisms that have sought to depreciate it, so it becomes less and less meaningful.
So you think we've gone from more democratic to less?
In a sense, because when you bring in women and black folks and non-propertied males, if you're going to maintain a sense of an establishment and so on, you need to make money and other things count for more and the vote count for less and less. And part of what concerns me is that people have, in a sense, disenfranchised themselves to some extent. The media, I think, plays a crucial role in this. For example, in the marginalization of third-party candidates. You, Laura, on this show, you probably have guest after guest who is for, bringing down the military, for, downsizing the military, for single payer, against corporate trade deals, against the big Wall Street bailout that we've just seen this week, that both Biden and Obama and McCain, all of them were for it, against the sort of Main Street Republicans, I'll use that term generously, and the Main Street Democrats. So you see this shift. And
so we have all those people, but they don't have a party that really supports them.
That's correct. And what I propose at votepact.org is that disenfranchised Republicans, in effect, and disenfranchised Democrats both team up and vote for the third parties of their choice.
All right, we'll hear how it works in just a minute. To give you a chance to weigh in on this, Steve. Democracy, republic, which is it? Officially, it's a republic, right?
Officially, it's a republic. We don't have an individual right as individual voters to vote for the presidential candidate. We vote for electors who then vote for us. But I think more importantly than that, we have these great mobilization efforts aimed around Election Day. And then once we know the results, whether we can trust them or not, basically people get the message from those in power to just go home and come back a year and a half from now. And what we really need is, an ongoing engagement of the citizenry so that basically the kinds of things that are, exploding before our very eyes these days don't really happen because the checks and balances that are supposed to be inherent in a democracy are largely absent when the citizens are not engaged.
So in the same way that I think it was Jean-Bertrand Aristide of Haiti said, democracy isn't what happens once every 4 years when you vote, it's what happens all the time. That's what gives you that's what is the temperature. That's how you take the temperature of a democracy.
And in fact, most of the barriers to voting can only be effective in races where there are lower turnouts and where people are not engaged enough to be really offended by these dumb hoops and hurdles that they have to go through or cross over to basically get in the booth and exercise their choice. If people really were more engaged, they just wouldn't put up with this nonsense.
The electoral, or as some people have called it, the electoral college, what the heck is it, and why is it so important, and why do we have it? Start with you, Stephen.
Why is it so important? Because they get to choose who the president is.
And we all remember this from, well, 2000 was probably a lot of people, their big education into, wait a minute, there's something called an electoral college that can decide this election regardless of what the popular vote says. Should we do away with it?
I think so. I mean, it's an antiquated notion hatched several hundred years ago so that small states wouldn't get overpowered by the large states. You know, we had a very kind of a localized sense of a nation with mass communication, with mass travel. You know, people aren't localized so much in their states and their localities. We're one nation rather than a collection of states. I think we should have a national vote that's decided by the electorate and not by an intermediary electoral college that's perhaps looking out for or was once looking out for the interests of smaller states over larger states.
It still does, doesn't it? I mean, certainly with respect to the distribution of electoral votes, you have a favoring of those states with small votes, small populations, because they get an undue number of electors based on particularly the Senate skew. We'll come to you, Sam. I mean, surely the Electoral College is at the heart of what you were complaining about, that we kind of have a rigged system.
We do have a rigged system. I think the Electoral College is on its way out. That there is a move afoot that will, in effect, get around it without eliminating it, but will, in effect, make the popular vote the one that chooses the president. Another major reform, I think, is something like instant runoff voting, where people get to rank their choices 1, 2, 3, rather than you can only vote for one person, and it's as if you regard the other candidates the same. And I think that that's a big fallacy, and I think that that's a crucial reform.